Alright, so to begin with, we're just going to jump right in with the spectrum. I'm going to place the geometry node down and I'll call it FX spectrum. I've also just got a human Tommy here just for real life world reference, which is always handy to have. So let's dive into the spectrum geometry, and we're going to place an ocean spectrum node down, which you might have guessed. And straight away, if I middle click this, you'll see that it generates a few things. We get a bunch of attributes, point and primitive, and we get 4 volumes. So we have phase, frequency, amplitude, and mask, and they all have a voxel count as well, which we'll touch on in a few minutes. So this is kind of the data that gives our information for the deformation of our ocean. And that's cool, that's useful, but I kind of like to see it. So if I put an ocean evaluate down, and we plug the spectrum into the second input, display the evaluate, hide Tommy, you'll see we still see nothing. So we can add a preview grid here, and that shows us something. The size of this is basically determined by the grid size of our incoming spectrum. So if I reduce that to around about 10 or to 200, 100, you can see how it changed in accordance with that. But in general, I probably wouldn't use this at all. It's good practice to kind of input our own geometry into this, because let's say you have a lake or a river or an ocean or even a pond, and you know how big it is, where it is. It's good to just visualize your spectrum on the actual geometry that you're going to be looking at. So I wouldn't worry about the preview grid unless you're really in a rush and you just want to see something. And an advantage of this is we can also control the resolution of our input grid by feeding it ourselves. So I'm going to reduce this to 10 and bring back to me, and you'll see straight away that it looks quite bad. If I go to wireframe mode, you see we've got plenty of polygons here, but they're not really being utilized properly. We're still getting loads of almost low detail grid-like shapes, and that's because the actual resolution of our spectrum is the handicap here. So at the top of the parameters here, we have resolution exponent, which is essentially the spectrum resolution. If I increase that, you'll see that we get those kind of blocky shapes called out, and we get more detail, high frequency detail come through. So in general, 10's a solid number to start with, I'd say. Let's say you have a really like a mid to wide shot like this, 10 can get you the detail. If you go higher than that, you kind of won't really benefit from that because you won't see the difference. It'll come to a point where the actual frequency detail is going to be smaller than the pixel from your camera, so it's kind of pointless and it's a waste. And if I kind of refer back to those volumes that we generated by placing this node down, if I middle click again, a resolution exponent of 10, we're about 1,000,000 voxels. If I go all the way up to 12, we come all the way to 17 million almost. So really, if we're this far out and we're not gaining any visual benefit from this, we're just burning 16 million extra voxels for no reason, and then it'll be slower and heavier really unnecessarily. So it's good to keep in mind that. Now on the counter of that, let's say you have the opposite. You have a really close-up shot and it's quite hero like this, and you've got plenty of resolution still, but 10's kind of not cutting it still. It's still quite blocky. In that case, you might want to up to something like 12, and you get something a lot nicer, but at the cost of obviously a higher voxel count. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis of how far you need to go with that. In production, I've never really gone higher than 12, and I don't really go less than 10 unless you're doing like a really low frequency wave like underneath the layers themselves. But yeah, just don't go up for the sake of 12 for the sake of it, because you're just going to be slowing yourself down and it'll be more memory, and you won't really reap the rewards of what you should be. So remember that. Now I'm going to up our grid to, so let me drop that down to 10 again. I'm going to go to 200 by 200, and we're going to talk about grid size here. So grid size is essentially, as the description says, it's just the world space size of the generated spectrum. So think of it as this is the size of our grid tile, of our spectrum tile. Now, if you've got a keen eye, you might be able to spot that these waves look really quite repetitive and in lines. And that's because if our grid size of 50, it's basically, and we have an input of 200, it's tiling those 50 size grids inside this. So if I go change this to 200, you'll see that we don't get that tiling aspect anymore. However, on the counter to that, we do get a different wave shape. If I low to 50, you'll see that we get a little bit more smaller waves and like higher frequency. So it's useful to keep in mind that that can affect that. Obviously with the tiling thing, let's say you have a really large ocean, not 100, 1000 by 1000, and you're at 50 and this is your shot, you're looking out to the horizon, that won't cut it. And you can obviously increase the grid size, but then it changes the wave shape. So we'll talk about in a little while how you can kind of work around that, because we can use instancing, not worry about these kind of tiles that it uses instead. But I think it's important just to know that that could be a problem if you're not using instancing. And again, like you might not need it. Let's say you only have a grid of 50 by 50 and this is your shot and you craft your spectrum on this size, you could get away with it, but it's just, as a quick, it could be a gotcha moment if you're not sure about what that does. So grid center is essentially just an offset of that grid. I wouldn't really touch it, you don't need to. Depth, it specifies the depth of it. It does change it slightly, especially on the lower values, but for the most part I've never really changed that and noticed a usable use case for it. If you do know a use case, please yell at me, because it'd be good to know. Gravity, I'd leave at 9.8 unless you're doing something quite bespoke. Seed is just the seed of the ocean, as is most things with a seed value. You can just change that for a different sort of pattern. Time offset is quite handy. Let's say you have an ocean you like, and let's say I really like this wave here, but I want it to be a bit further back. You can play around with this time offset and just kind of, time your ocean to hit at certain points. But for the most part, again, don't really worry about that. If you want those more kind of custom waves, you could use the ocean wave stop, which I'll talk about in a little while too. And then finally, time scale kind of says what it does on the tin. If you want a fast ocean, you want your waves to be really fast, up that. On a counter, really slow, lower it down that. That will kind of just depend on the size of the ocean waves that you're using. And, again, it's an artistic choice at the end of the day. Loop over time, it kind of just does, again, what it says. It loops. This is probably quite useful if you're doing like motion design and you want those kind of repeatable videos. But in terms of general VFX, probably won't worry about it, because a real life ocean doesn't really match up perfectly every 10 seconds. So I wouldn't worry about that either. So that's kind of a summary of the top options there on the spectrum node. Now for the juicy bit there under the wind tab, you'll see at the top we have spectrum type, and there's two options. There's Philips and there's TMA. So these are basically the algorithms of the spectrum. TMA, I believe, is the newer one, and it uses Encino waves. And Philips is the older and more traditional one, and it uses the Tessendorf waves, which I believe is still the standard in general when working with oceans. So I'll focus on Philips anyway, because I prefer Philips. But just for the sake of discussion, the main difference here with the parameters is the directional bias and directional movement are actually called swell and fetch on the TMA, and they're slightly different, and I'll explain them very quickly now. So swell basically is, in fact, no, we'll go back to Philips and I'll come back when we get to these two and compare the two. So let's go to a camera I created, and we'll call it clock. So if you look here on our bottom left of our viewport, you'll see that the x-axis is pointing up in this camera. So the direction of your spectrum is aligned with the x-axis. So if it's at 0, it's going to go down the x-axis in a positive way. And if I play that, you'll see it's going up in this case. If I want it to go the opposite direction, i.e. negative x, I go 180. If I want it to go to the right, 90. I want it to go to the left, 270. Think of it as a 360 degree compass. Is worth noting you can do like negative 90, and it would be the same as 270. I just find it a bit more intuitive to think of it as 0 to 360 as opposed to using negative values. But I think that's fairly self-explanatory in terms of direction. You just got to remember x is 0, and then you're going based on a compass around that axis. So speed is the wind speed of the waves. If If you increase that, you're going to get larger waves and a bit more like wave range. As you can see, if I go to 30, you see this is quite dramatic. This is probably quite high on a Beaufort scale. Maybe something like the North Sea. I would not want to be on a boat in this. But as you know, there's a lot more attenuation to the waves. They go higher, they drop lower, which means you can get a lot more of that range out of it. A probably more realistic kind of standard ocean would be like around 4, perhaps. It's a little more calmer, a little more believable. You can even drop lower if you want to do like a lake or on a windy day. But in general, speed is a useful parameter in terms of kind of crafting the shape and size of your waves. It is worth noting that you can actually coincide this with some of the parameters at the top, like grid size. If let's say I really want a high frequency small layer, you can achieve it with like higher speeds, but it's just kind of unnecessary. I could drop this down to like, if I just make this grid a bit lower so we get more resolution, I could drop our speed to 0.5 and you'll see we get small waves, but I kind of want a bit more out of it. We can also drop the grid size to like 25. That cuts that in half. I can even go lower than that if I really wanted to. Obviously the amplitude then messes up, so I'd have to reduce the amplitude quite drastically. I'm going to increase that slightly again. But this is kind of just showing that multiple parameters often can play with each other and you can achieve an effect that way. There's a few ways to do it, but if you're wanting a really high frequency wave, I would start with speed, then reduce grid size, and you can also increase the resolution. That might bring some more up. Obviously, then you're going to be capped by your actual geometry polygon count as well. But it's worth noting that that is a way to achieve certain things. And if you want larger waves, you go for bigger grid size, bigger speed. That's not a grid size there. Let me check that. And then obviously bring our scale back. There's a bunch of combinations you could do, but that's just a way of doing it. So speed is very useful in general. I like to think of speed as just the general size of the waves, and then these two kind of are a factor of that you can also tailor in. So the next option is directional bias. So it's a little confusing with directional movement if you don't know what the two differences are. Directional bias basically changes the shape of the wave. So let's say if I go to 0, it's kind of not, and we're going to reduce this down to 3, I think, and then also increase our size up to 50 again. So we have a bit more of an ocean here. Directional bias is 0. You'll see that there's not really a bias towards the shape in the direction it's going. So obviously in our clock view, compass view I should have called it, direction, it should be going up in this case, but we don't really see that in terms of the actual wave shape. Whereas if I go to 10, you'll see that they do a line down that axis as in the direction they're going, as if it was a windy day, which is a really useful parameter for, let's say, something, I don't know, you could do tidal waves perhaps, or like a windy day at sea. This bias is very handy, and it does coincide with the directional movement, because for example, if I reduce this to 0, you'll see that our wave shape does change to be directional, but our actual movement of the waves aren't really moving with the direction we set. It just kind of goes back and forth on the same spot. Whereas on the counter, if we go to 1, it's very much moving in the direction we set. So these two parameters we can sort of play around with. We can still have it move with our directional movement quite a bit, but our waves can be less directional. I can imagine it's a little bit confusing, but think of the movement as the actual movement, and the bias is just the shape adjusted with the movement, if that makes sense. So if you want them still to move, but you don't want them to look like they're really long and windswept, then you can reduce the bias but keep the movement up. Hopefully that explains it. The best way is to try and have a play around with it yourself, and I think that will get you a pretty good understanding of those two, because then once you crack that, they're quite simple to use, and they're very handy in terms of matching reference with plates and stuff, because you can match the shape of the waves. And then last of all, we have chop here, which is a fun one, because think of this as the sharpness of a crest almost. If I increase this value here, you'll see that these almost converge in on each other. You do have to be careful because if you go too high, they'll overlap and they'll make this weird, horrible, meaty ridge, which I wouldn't recommend. And then that would also change with as you change the speed. So if I actually reduce the speed, but our chop value is still quite high, you'll see that it almost unresolves itself. So these are very much a parameter that I would probably not worry about at the start. I would craft the general shape of your wave. Let's say I want big waves. I don't want them like this, but then also at the end, that's when I'd kind of determine the chop values, because if you do go too high, obviously you're going to get this and it's going to mess up the normals and it's going to be the whole thing. But it is very useful if you do want to sort of have a little bit more of that crispy cusp, which, you know, especially in a windy ocean or like a quite dramatic ocean, that would be what you want. So I'm going to reset it to default. It's kind of a quick brush over the wind parameters. Hopefully that kind of gives you a gist of what they do. And then I'm going to move to the next tab, which is the amplitude, which is also very important. So normalize basically normalize the scale. If I turn that off, you'll see that it goes wappy. We don't want that, so usually just leave it on. It makes everything a lot easier. And it's normalized to this reference wind here. If I reduce this, you'll see that it quite drastically changes. Again, I've never really turned this off production or in any use case in personal projects. For the most part, I just leave it as it is. The big one is scale. It kind of is quite obvious. It's just the scale of the spectrum. So if you want it not to be that much, or if you want it crazy high for some reason, you can obviously tweak that. Gaussian here, or the random distribution. For the most part, I've always left it as Gaussian. It's basically just the way it distributes the waves. I think Gaussian's fine, especially when we're using wave instancing. I think when you do like a grid size and you have, like, if you were doing it like a tileable way, that's when it might play into a use case, but for the most part I wouldn't worry about it. Now min wavelength is very useful because let's say you want a low frequency underlying wave, or you want your waves to be, you know, always bigger than a certain amount. We can increase this value, and what you'll see is it kind of calls the high frequency detail, and it basically says, is your wavelength smaller than this value? If so, you know, we're going to filter you out almost, and we're going to change it so that your wavelength is nice and big. So this is useful because let's say you could actually lower the resolution here, and let's say if I didn't have it on, and I don't know, maybe 5, you'd see that it's really quite bad, but maybe 5 is a bit low. Go to 7. Oh, that's the wrong button. And I turn this off. You can see we're getting some grid here, but let's say we do just want a really low frequency value. We don't care about the high detail. We can maintain a low resolution here, but we can increase this min wavelength, and it will kind of blur those out again. I would be careful because when you merge it, you still might get these weird things, but in conjunction, you can. It's basically a safe way of saying, okay, I want it to be low frequency, but I don't want to waste much resolution on it. You can play around with this resolution, min wavelength here, and kind of dial that in. It's an option. I think the two most useful here are the filter above and below. So think of this coincides with the resolution exponent at the top. So if you think, in fact, we'll demonstrate it a lot easier on a smaller grid here, and we'll change this to 12 again. So we're getting these really high detail bits here that only really came out when we set this to 12. So if we turn on filter above 10, you'll see that it got rid of those two, those high layers. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's good because you can isolate specific wavelengths here that show up at different resolutions. So let's say I only want low frequency waves. I would get rid of any waves that would show up in resolutions above 6. And then that would just leave me with these nice low ones, which means that I can basically separate my layers into, you know, large frequency, mid frequency, high frequency, and you have a lot more control. Basically, that's what we're aiming for here. Control, 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 because you can really craft and match references super easy when you know what you're looking for. Again, we can do the opposite of that. We can get rid of all the low frequency waves, and we say, okay, I want a layer of just pure, really high frequency. This is particularly useful, let's say if you've got a flip sim, you've meshed your flip sim, or even you've done a guided simulation with large waves on your sim, and you've meshed it, and you got the general detail, but you don't have that really crispy high detail that you would have got elsewhere. We can make a spectrum with just this really high resolution exponent isolated, so we don't get much large frequency like movement, and we can apply just this to bring out that detail at the end. So hopefully I explained that a little bit okay, but it's very useful. Think of it as just a way to isolate specific wavelengths, really, and then you can just kind of mix and match and go from there, really. Remap amplitude is just remap. I've never really used this, to be honest with you. I wouldn't worry about it. You can have a play around with the remap ramp and stuff, but for the most part, I won't touch it. So hopefully that's a bit of a summary on the amplitude and wind. And we'll move on to instancing next.